we're being warned to brace for yet another cost of living blow. Today, the Reserve Bank is expected to deliver its biggest hike in the official cash rate in more than 20 years. Well, that certainly stopped the music dead in its tracks, didn't it? National Party leader Christopher Luxon joins us this morning for more on that. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Melissa. Firstly, congratulations on your announcement. It's fantastic news.
Thank you very much. We're very excited. Not so excited probably about this OCR lift that we're expecting today. In March, we started talking about the cost of living being a crisis. That's when the government acknowledged it was at crisis point. Do you think that there have been improvements since then?
Sorry, Mel, I missed your question. Would you mind repeating it again?
Sure thing. In March, the government started admitting that the cost of living was at crisis point. Do you think that there have been improvements since then?
Well, look, I mean, the news today is going to be incredibly alarming and cause a lot of sleepless nights. Talk about mental health challenges. It's just going to ramp that up big time because, an increase in interest rates, on a $700,000 mortgage as people refix it is something like $30,000 that they've got to find after tax just to pay the interest bill. Frankly, I don't think the government's doing enough. This is a government that actually doesn't have an economic plan to manage inflation. As a consequence, it's got its foot flat on the accelerator, spending like never before. The Reserve Bank is now having to come in and put its foot flat on the brake, and that's leading to rising interest rates. Frankly, interest rates are having to go higher because the government is mismanaging the economy. So, we want to see a proper plan from this government to actually tackle the underlying cause, which is inflation, and what they can do about it and what they can control it.
Okay, so what factors would you have to see that the cost of living is no longer at crisis point? What would be those turning factors for you?
Well, you want to see inflation back below 3%, which is the band that we've been managing to over the last 30 years. At the moment, we've got inflation that's been stubbornly high. You remember last month, people thought that it would start to drop. Originally, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and Grant Robertson said that it was going to be transitory. It would just come in and come out of the economy after COVID. That is not the case. It's got embedded. And as I said right from the beginning, almost a year ago, when I was a leader, you have to deal with this now, and you have to start making adjustments each and every quarter, because the longer it goes, the worse it gets, and the less options you've got to fix it.
Okay, so if you're saying that it would no longer be at crisis point when inflation gets back to 3%, if you came into government, how soon could you achieve that?
Well, what we're going to do is implement what we call our 5-point, inflation fighting plan. It's one, control costs so they're not passed on to businesses with leading to higher prices. The second big challenge we've got, Melissa, is actually we're constraining the productive economy with a massive amount of immigration bottlenecks.
Would you have a timeline in mind?
We've talked a lot about spending.
Would you say by this point...
We're going to be moving as fast as we possibly... Sorry, I mean, there are some international factors which I get, let's be clear about that, and the government talks about those and blames them exclusively for the challenge here, but there's an awful lot the government can control domestically here in New Zealand, and that's why I say we've got to control the costs, remove the bottlenecks, have really disciplined spending, give people some tax relief so they can actually spend the money, save it as they see fit, and importantly, get the Reserve Bank exclusively focused 100% on fighting inflation and put that single mandate back in place.
You mentioned...
That's what we've got to do to deal with the underlying causes of what's causing inflation and pain for people at the pump, with their mortgages and with their food prices.
You mentioned mental health before. How many additional mental health beds would National pledge if in government?
Well, what we're saying here is, again, we've got a government, and we supported spending the $1.9 billion. Mental health is a New Zealand issue. It's not a party issue.
So you wouldn't cut back on that?
But the bottom line...
You'd keep funding for mental health at that level?
This is what we would do. We would actually make sure we have a dedicated, independent, accountable mental health minister. The reason is, I want mental health, I think, has been a second-class issue in the health agenda. I want it pulled out, I want it managed independently, and I want to hold a minister accountable for delivery.
And how many additional beds would you pledge?
Well, I'm not going to get into that today, Melissa, but what I'll tell you is that we need to put targets to access to services back in. The number of times I talk to parents of a 16 or 17-year-old waiting 4 to 7 months to get assessed, and the reason is we need to use things like, get our workforce in place. We're short psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health nurses. We need to be able to make sure that we're using technology in the most appropriate way, because that could be a way in which we actually get through some of those workforce challenges and get access to services quickly. And we need to power up community organisations. So, strong leadership, accountable leadership, dedicated mental health minister, clear targets, power up community organisations, leverage technology. Those are the things that we need to be doing and taking seriously, not just as a second-class thought in the health agenda. It's got to be in its own right, standalone.
I want to talk about truancy, and this is something that you spoke about on the show this time last week. You took aim at some principals, saying some of the blame lays with them. Since then, you've been saying that some of the blame lays with parents too. How would a national government make those groups more accountable then? What specific policies would you have to bring what you would deem to be bad principals and bad parents into line?
Well, look, my point is really simple. The Labor government's created a culture of excuses. We have a major problem here. We cannot be a developed country in the world with 60% of our kids not going to school regularly. So what I've been saying is that's a responsibility of three actors. It's a responsibility of the government to make sure that there are resources in place to support the schools as they cut down on absence and truancy. My point last week was a very simple one. We have 2,500 schools. We have everyone's working hard. I get that, but the outcomes aren't in place. We've got abysmal outcomes on attendance. So we have to ask the question, there are some principals that are doing an exceptionally good job of being able to drive attendance. Let's learn from them, replicate that in other schools. And my final, most important point has been that parents need to take responsibility. Wake up, get the kids to school. You want your kids to have more opportunity than you had. So, that's what our parents did for us. It's what we expect parents to do for their kids going forward.
Will you have specific policies to penalise bad parents and bad principals?
Well, what we're doing now is Erica Stanford and I have been looking into this issue for the last 6 months or so, even a bit longer, and we'll come out in the new year with a policy on it and, that's pretty detailed. But what I want to say to you is all options need to be on the table, for parents, for schools and for the government. There is nothing more important than getting our kids into school. If we cannot get them into the gates of the school, they cannot learn, they cannot get ahead. As I've said before, it's a moral crisis, it's a social crisis, but it's an economic crisis as well. And that's so important to our future, right?
Specifically target the people that you're talking about?
We'll talk to all three groups, whether it's schools, whether it's parents and whether it's the government's own actions. What I can tell you is I'll make sure the national government holds itself to account and holds itself to responsibility too to actually fix this problem, because we cannot go forward as a country. We can't realise the opportunities that we have ahead of us. We can't get higher paying jobs and salaries, which we want for all New Zealanders. We can't make ourselves fundamentally wealthier if we're not going to educate ourselves well.
Are there bad parents at the schools that you went to, St Kentigern College, Howard College and Christchurch Boys?
Yeah, look, I'm sure there's parents that are doing a great job. Let's be clear, parenting's incredibly tough. You'll learn that, and I guess you are learning it. But I mean, the point is, it's an incredibly difficult job. I get that, but actually, our parents made sure we went to school. We need to make sure our kids go to school. So, the bottom line is, we need to look at anything and everything that's working here in New Zealand, but also overseas. The government loves to blame excuses for anything other than themselves, and they blame a lot of this on COVID. Lots of other countries had COVID. Lots of other developed countries have much higher levels, almost double the rates of regular attendance at their schools as well. So let's learn from them too.
Chris, I just have to be very quick with this last one, but we were just speaking before we interviewed you about what makes people happy, because we've been looking at what is stressing people out. And we wondered whether it was money, relationships and sleep. Would that be your list, and where would you structure that list?
No, I'd start with relationships first and foremost. When you're in your happy place, it's always when you're with the people that you love and that fill you up and you get to spend time with and hang out with. So, T-shirts, shorts, hanging out with loved ones, listening to some good music is always what I think works for me.
Nice one. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. National Party leader Christopher Luxon.